Aperture is a hole within the lens through which light travels. Aperture works in a similar way to your eye. Your pupil gets smaller when the light gets brighter. In photography, the opening in the lens is called aperture. You can decide the size which will allow more or less light to reach the camera's sensor. As the aperture changes, it alters the amount of light that can reach your camera's sensor. A large aperture will allow a lot of light to pass, resulting in a brighter image. A small aperture does the opposite, restricting the light entering and therefore making it darker. Aperture is measured in f numbers. Whenever you see an aperture value, the letter f will appear before the number. The f stands for focal ratio. Size can seem confusing because it is reversed from what you would expect. The large apertures have smaller numbers, and the small apertures have the highest numbers. In this image, the exposure time and ISO remain the same. Notice how the image becomes darker as the f number increases and the aperture becomes smaller. Depth of field is the amount of your photograph that appears sharp from front to back. Some images have a thin or shallow depth of field where the background is completely out of focus. Other images have a large or wide depth of field where both foreground and background are sharp. A large aperture results in large amounts of the image being out of focus with only some of the image in focus. A small aperture results in more of the image being in sharp focus. In this mode, the photographer sets the aperture and the camera chooses the most suitable shutter speed. This allows the photographer to control depth of field and to use aperture to control exposure. To recap, aperture is a hole within the lens through which light travels. The size of the aperture affects the amount of light entering the camera, so aperture can be used to control exposure. Aperture is measured in f numbers. There is an inverse relationship between f number and aperture. The smaller the f number, the bigger the aperture. The bigger the f number, the smaller the aperture. Depth of field is the amount of your photograph that appears sharp from front to back. Aperture can be used to control depth of field. A large aperture results in a shallow depth of field. A small aperture results in a large depth of field. In aperture priority mode, the photographer selects the aperture and the camera adjusts the shutter speed for correct exposure.